Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Brad, LAPSS, for having me here today. Basically, my idea here is to tell you this story that started off in 2006 when my interest in doing research with ayahuasca began. Back then, we were interested in using neuroimaging tools, mainly fMRI, to investigate some of the neural bases of the phenomenology of ayahuasca, of the effects of ayahuasca. That first set of experiments, we worked with very closely with people that had a lot of experience with ayahuasca from one of the Santo Daime churches in São Paulo. So most of the volunteers for the first set of experiments that we did with fMRI were all experienced individuals from the Santo Daime Church. And back then, I had my first contact with the Santo Daime, and became clear in 2006 that some people that were in the ayahuasca, in that ayahuasca group particularly, seem to have got some improvement in their depression symptoms, in their anxiety, in their substance use disorders. So it just became clear that we could try to do some science, or trying to understand a little bit better from the scientific perspective what were the antidepressant effects of ayahuasca. I just want to give you a maybe I should tell you just so that you have a perspective on who's up here speaking. You'd see that I'm basically a naive person, in the sense that I don't have a lot of experience with ayahuasca. My personal experience with ayahuasca is restricted to 10 experiences in different contexts. So 12 years working with ayahuasca, I have 10 experiences with ayahuasca. I come from physics, so my background is in physics, which means that I'm also a naive in terms of psychiatry, psychology, neuroscience. All my experience restricts to these last 12 years that I've been working with it. So just to give you a general overview of depression today, this is the biggest study that were out there about depression. And basically, it shows you two main things that's still out there for any antidepressant treatment. The first one is that about 30% of the patients 30% of the patients do not respond to any antidepressant medication that exists, or antidepressant treatment that we have so far. The second point is that every antidepressant medication takes about 2 weeks in order to achieve any kind of antidepressant effect. So it's like you're driving a car and you start turning the wheel of the car, and you have to wait 2 weeks until that car actually turns. Which is, that's a big issue in psychiatry. It's a big issue when you're trying to treat any human condition, especially the way we treat human condition today. Because of that, and because of all the reports that we got from people in the church, then it became apparent that we should try to do some science, or trying to understand that from a scientific perspective. And that began then in 2008. In 2006, we had the first idea. In 2008, we started running the first protocol, which means that we had patients with severe depression coming to a hospital in São Paulo to have a single session with ayahuasca. All these patients, we had an ethic window to work with these patients because they were not responding to the treatment that they were doing. And because of that, most of them, they have to go through what we call a washout period, which is a period that the patient is not undertaking any medication, any antidepressant medication. The reason for that is that if you're changing medication, for some medications you don't want to have an interaction between the previous medication and the next medication that you're going to give. So you want to have this washout period from the previous medication before you give a second medication. This washout period usually lasts for 2 weeks. So we asked the IRB if we could conduct a single session with ayahuasca toward the end of the washout period, so that we would bring the patients to the hospital. Part of the washout period would be done in the hospital, and we would just have them going through a washout, through a single ayahuasca session. The main idea here is first to see how people would react to have first an ayahuasca session inside the hospital, so completely outside a more conventional setting that we have for ayahuasca. Second is to see how the set, in other words, how their condition, their depressive condition would influence their experience. So basically we wanted to see how these patients would tolerate an ayahuasca experience inside the hospital. On top of that, we also we applied a couple of clinical validated scales for depression. In other words, we have these scales that have to be applied by a psychiatrist, and that after you just have a number that means how severe that depression is. So we applied 2 scales, besides some scales to evaluate the more of the adverse effects. And these are the first results we have for 7 patients. So this we ran with 7 patients. What you see here is the mean score for 3 scales. The Hamilton D scale, which is one scale that measures the depressive symptoms. The MADRS scale, which is another scale for depression, and the YMRS, which is a scale that measures mania-like kind of symptoms. What you see here, down here, is the symptoms of mania that we have during the session. So this is minutes, up to 180 minutes. This is day 1, day 7, day 14, and day 21. These are the clinical scales for depression. So you see that at baseline, before the session, it was from moderate to severe depression. And then during the session, you already have a tendency to decrease. And one day after the session, we do have a significant decrease on the depressive symptoms. So that gave some argument to have a bigger sample size. So we increased the sample size for 17 patients. We also followed these patients for 21 days. And you do see here that in this pilot study, the symptoms become and stay reduced for about 21 days after the single session with ayahuasca. But that's just 7 patients. So we increased for 17 patients, and besides doing the clinical evaluation, 8 hours after the session, we had all the patients going through an neuroimaging evaluation, which is called single photon emission computed tomography. So SPECT, that's the technique we used, is capable of evaluating changes on blood flow. So basically, we were interested in looking for changes in subacute changes in the brain that happened 8 hours after the ayahuasca session. And that's the result for the second study with 17 patients. Again, what you see here, we added another scale, but what you see here first are the same 2 scales that we used before, the Hamilton and the MADRS. So you do see that at baseline, patients had from moderate to severe depression. It decreased already, and one day after, it was already significantly lower than we had before, and that lasted for about 21 days again. In the larger group. These are the SPECT results, and basically what we found was increased blood flow in 3 structures that have been related to depression, which are the nucleus accumbens, the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, and the insula. So these 3 structures had an increased blood flow after the 8 hours after the single session with ayahuasca. These two studies have a problem, or a great limitation, I'd say, which is the fact that none of these studies have controlled for the placebo effect. Most of the time we hear about the placebo effect as something that's bad, in the sense that we are always trying to control something that seems to be a fake process. I just want to get ahead of myself and tell you that, in fact, after these experiences that I'm going to tell you about the third project that we conducted with ayahuasca, the whole group just realized that the placebo effect is one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen, to a point that in the middle of the experiment, we thought of changing from ayahuasca to understanding a little bit more about the placebo effect. I mean, we saw patients with 30 years of depression just go in remission after a placebo session. I mean, I did see it with my own eyes. And that makes a big difference, I mean, for understanding the whole idea of what are the effects of psychedelics and so on. So I just want to tell you that my perspective on having a placebo effect is not necessarily, what I'm saying is not that the placebo effect is bad. In fact, what I'm saying is that the placebo effect seems to be a big hope for a lot of these patients, for us. But anyways, the placebo, if you're trying to show the antidepressant effect of any substance, you have to control for the placebo effect. There's no way you're going to go out there and say, I'm trying to do science, and I'm trying to show, or I'm trying to explore the antidepressant effect of a substance. If I do not compare that against the placebo, that's pretty much nothing in the psychiatry realm. And that's because if you are doing a clinical trial with depression, about 30 to 40% of the patients do respond to the placebo. And what I'm saying is that about 40% of the patients that come to the trial, they will have a positive benefit when they are out of a placebo, of a session with a placebo. So that's high, that's huge. And whatever result we had in our previous studies could be just due to a placebo effect. On top of that, it's very hard. So, in 2010, we started to plan this randomized control trial in Brazil, now in the northeast of Brazil, in a city called Natal. And we started planning the randomized trial, and that was a challenge on its own, just because as I'll show you, the experiment ran from January 2014 to June 2016. It was a 2.5-year project. Just the data acquisition, it was actually a 9-year project, the whole thing. So we had 218 patients screened. A lot of them just couldn't be part of the trials for many reasons. We randomized 35 patients, so 35 patients were up for the trial. Half went to an ayahuasca session, half went through a placebo session. The first challenge in doing a randomized trial with a psychedelic substance is, I'm just going to go ahead, is to preserve blindness. So what you want to do with randomized trials is basically that half of the people that have the placebo, they're not sure they had the placebo, and people that had the ayahuasca are not sure they had the ayahuasca. But that's very difficult to do with psychedelics. I mean, it's really hard. So in order to improve, I'd say, blindness in these studies, we basically took three additional actions that you don't usually take in other studies. The first one is that all of our participants, they were naive to ayahuasca. So that was their first experience with ayahuasca. The second, so they did not know what to expect, and we also tried to emphasize In a lot of the conversations we have with the patients, we try to emphasize the fact that a lot of people do drink ayahuasca and do not have a lot of effects. And you can drink the placebo and have some effects. So a lot of people just get confused because of the instructions. The second thing is that we developed, this is the placebo that we had, so we used in natural ayahuasca, we didn't use capsules. This is the placebo, so we basically tried to have a placebo that looked, that had the same color of ayahuasca, that had a bitter and a sour taste. But overall, we also added a little tiny amount of zinc sulfur. And zinc sulfur, it has some gastrointestinal effects. So a lot of our subjects, most of our subjects did feel nausea. One vomited and one had diarrhea on the placebo. So it was not a psychoactive placebo, but a lot of people did think that they had an ayahuasca session when they had the placebo. I just want to open a quote here because we have another experiment going on with experienced individuals from the church. And we could not do the same thing, right? So we could not just give the ayahuasca or the placebo the same way we did. But curiously enough, about 30% of the experienced individuals that had the placebo thought they had a very light ayahuasca experience. 30%. So what I'm trying to say here is just that the placebo effect, or whatever we call the placebo effect, is important. Setting. So we had that, as I said, we had that in the hospital. At first point, we thought that this would be difficult, or it would add on some difficulty for these individuals. But in fact, it was not the case. In fact, having the first experience in the hospital, for most of the individuals, we asked them, it was, first of all, 100% of our individuals said that they felt secure during the experience. And that tells a lot on how significant the experience. I mean, the first thing you need to try to do when having a full psychedelic experience is to let it go. And in order to let it go, you need to feel safe. So a lot of our subjects said, well, you know, this is a really good environment for having the first experience just because I was feeling completely safe here. It was in a hospital. This is the interview afterwards. I just want to point out, so most of the volunteers would stay in this recliner. We did not have a lot of interference during their session. We would be right next to them, not like I am here. Right here, I'm talking to the volunteer, but we would be in the room right next to where the subjects were. This paper, this randomized trial was just published a week ago after a long journey, 14 months journey, 12 different journals. It was hopefully and finally accepted. The story of the publication of this paper would give a talk on its own, I think. And these are the results we have. This is the main result we have. So now, instead of having just a group with ayahuasca, we have another group that did drink up the placebo. We do see already a between group difference at day 1. In other words, the result we had with our open label trial is still holding, even if we compare against the placebo. We do see a significant effect of ayahuasca. We also did see a significant placebo effect. So it's interesting, if we look at the effect sizes like Brad was saying before, I just want to tell you one thing, that psilocybin effect size is inflated for one reason, because most of the other studies are doing between group comparison. The psilocybin study, the one that you've mentioned, is an open label study. So you don't have anything to compare against. You're just doing in this effect size, not this effect size. And what matters for these studies is this effect size, the between group effect size. So the between group effect size that we have is high anyways. It's above 0.8, which is higher than any other antidepressant besides ketamine. So if we compare our results against ketamine, which is the most promising fast-acting antidepressant, this is a comparison between our results and the results with ketamine. So you do see that the effect sizes at day 1 and day 2, they are compatible. But at day 7, we have an effect size of ketamine of 0.4 and a 1.19 for the between group in the ayahuasca session. So there is this very interesting and complementary result we see here for ketamine as compared to ayahuasca, which is ketamine, you tend to have the most significant effect 1 day after dosing, and at 7 days after, you almost don't have any effect anymore. For ayahuasca, our effect was smallest at day 1, although compared to the ketamine, and it was largest at day 7. So it's a bit different. This is the response rate. So in other words, it's just a way of quantifying the same results. I just want to point out one thing here, which is the high response rate we had for the placebo, which is in blue. So you do see that the response rate of the placebo was 40% at day 1, 57% at day 2, and 27% at day 7, which is high. It's pretty high. Ayahuasca, on the other hand, it maintained a high response rate for the 3 access points. So one of the reasons why we had such a high placebo effect is 2 reasons, and I want to point that out. The first one is most of our subjects come from this very poor part. Brazil is a pretty poor country, and Natal is a pretty poor part of Brazil. So most of our patients, they came from this very difficult socioeconomic situation, to a point that a lot of them would refer to our hospital as a 5-star hotel, and some of the subjects didn't want to leave. I'm serious. They stayed with us for 4 days. The whole session lasted for 4 days. They would come to the hospital on Tuesday and they would leave on Friday. Some of them would just ask to stay the weekend. Can I just stay until Sunday? Just because I don't want to go back to my everyday life. So that's part of the high placebo effect we had for sure. The other part of the high placebo effect we had was because a lot of our subjects, 76% of our subjects, had some sort of personality disorder. And personality disorder, for every study with psychedelic, personality disorder is an exclusion criteria. So, and for many reasons. And part of that is because you expect to have a very difficult session when you have patients with personality disorders, particularly narcissistic disorders. And we did have that. We did have 78% of our patients did have some kind of personality disorders. And in fact, some of our sessions were pretty challenging, especially for a physicist and an engineer and people like that. So this is one of the reasons why we had such a high placebo effect. We are also exploring other parts of this project, so I didn't have time to tell you, but I'm just going to go ahead really quick and go through this just so that you understand why did the project took 85 weeks, or 91 weeks actually, 3 years. It was because for this project, we did not only evaluate exclusively the clinical symptoms for depression. We evaluated a whole different, we did a lot of different measurements. One day before the session and one day after the session. So the routine of the experiment was really tight. The patient would arrive in the hospital at Tuesday around noon, and then we had a lot of sessions all the way to Friday. So we would stay with the patient all the time. We'd have neuropsychological evaluation, MRI and fMRI, EEG. The subject would sleep in the lab from Tuesday to Wednesday. We'd collect blood. We'd have a session preparation. You'd stay in the lab for the whole day for the ayahuasca session. Thursday, you would come back, repeat the whole thing again, psychiatry, neuropsychology, MRI, EEG, sleep in the lab. Wake up Friday, psychiatry, and then around 9 a.m., the subject was allowed to go home. These are then, so we're expecting to have some more results coming soon. These are just some of the preliminary results that we have for these evaluations. The first one is we accessed cortisol of these patients, and basically what we found is that the imbalance on cortisol that we had prior to the ayahuasca session was balanced back again after the ayahuasca session. We also accessed different scales that have been developed to measure the quality of the psychedelic experience, such as the hallucinogen rating scale and the mystical experience questionnaire. What you do see here in blue is the placebo, in red is ayahuasca for the 2 scales. These are the factors of the scales. So you do see a significant effect for every factor, but mood and affect that had a huge variance between individuals. It's important to say that none of these measurements correlated with the improvement that the patients had afterwards. Some of the limitations, so I just have to say that, we have a very limited number of patients, just 29 patients for this trial, 17 for the other trial. So it's an ongoing work. I have to thank all of these people. It was a large group just because it was a large project. It was certainly the most joyful and stressful project that I've ever coordinated. I'm not sure what's next, but this is the big group that helped from different parts of the country, from different specialties. This is the hardcore, so this is the group that were conducting the experiments, and I'm sure that part of the placebo effect comes from this group. It was a really nice crew. It was the most amazing crew I've ever worked with. We had a lot of problems in the ship, as you can think of. It was a very expensive, a very time-demanding, stressful, but with such a nice crew, we managed to bring the ship back, and I'm here kind of safe and sound. And well, I have to, thank all these great people that help and that have been on our side throughout these projects. I have to thank our institution. So this experiment was conducted in the university hospital at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte, at the Brain Institute, where I'm a professor of neuroimaging. It was fully financed by the Brazilian government, by the Ministry of Science and Technology, and by the Ministry of Education. It was a pretty expensive project, as I just told you. And I have to thank Fulbright, not for the project, but for me being here. Right now I'm a Fulbright scholar at the UC Santa Barbara for 1 year and for the subsequent year. So I'll be in the United States for another year. So I'll be happy to take questions or email. I'm pretty available. And with that, I thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Draulio. Time for one question since we're running kind of late here.
I want to first congratulate you for conducting such an important study and finally getting it published. I know those barriers. I have a question. You could have tried as a placebo control or maybe as additional information to just separate the DMT from the MAO inhibitors. In other words, made a preparation that was just the BCAP and then had one that contained, the DMT. It's not surprising that the BCAP alone would be antidepressant because it's an MAO inhibitor mostly, Did you think of doing such a thing? There are anecdotal reports that just DMT by itself is an antidepressant.
Sure. So there are many reasons why we decided to go with this design. The first one is just because Brazil is, we do have the culture of ayahuasca around, which made things a little bit easier from many perspectives. The second thing is that, and that's becoming more clear with this study, is that the biggest hope we see with these substances, in my opinion, psilocybin or ayahuasca, is that we might need to find a balance between a pharmacological approach that psychiatry has been taking for the past few years with a more holistic approach of what mental disorders are about. In other words, we do know that dose is not something completely understood in the psychedelic community. In other words, you do have people that drink very small amount and have a significant effect, and the opposite. So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of what we are going to learn from psychedelics may come from a broader perspective. So instead of narrowing it down to a couple of substances, maybe the other approach we need to take is to broaden the explanations that we have for mental disorders, for how to treat mental disorders. And in that sense, I think that using in natura of something that it's not harmful at all. It's been culturally and ecologically selected somehow. So it's there. I just like to think that ayahuasca is not only Maui and DMT. So this is one of the reasons why we decided to go with ayahuasca instead of with the separate components.
We're going to do one more question.
Sure.
Hello, thank you very much, first of all, for your amazing talk. Good morning, everyone. So my question is this. I've been making ayahuasca and trying to learn a lot because I was a crack addict, and I have a mother that has been fighting with schizophrenia for the last 20 years. And I want to help her, because I already helped myself. And even my family, this subject, it's really, 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 you're in a thin line, because even when you're doing psychedelics, you seem to be the psychopath to everyone, because they don't know. And my mom has been seeing like this going further of me, and that I'm well now, because I have been doing ayahuasca, the toad in Zurich back with that he is here. And for me, it has been life-changing, So my question is, how can you, these are test subjects, so you maybe pick them up. But my question is, how can you convince the person that has been stuck because she doesn't want to do it, She's just, she wants to do it because, but he's trapped. She's so trapped in her life, and she even went to suicide, And I want to know how medicine and your experience can do this.
Sure. Well, first off, what I think that we are doing with science in this subject is bringing this very broad and expanded experience into this small bucket, which is science. So the reason why I'm telling you this is that if I were to ask anything about ayahuasca, I would not ask science. So I would not be asking Draulio this type of question. But on the other hand, at some point in the experiment, it became very clear to me. I was at some point, I was feeling this discomfort of offering ayahuasca to patients with depression, in the sense that a lot of times I would feel myself as the person who would, the person actually did not take the leap. I was the one who pushed him. And that for a lot of time would give me, some discomfort, in the sense that I do believe that for a lot, ayahuasca, and that comes from the Santo Daime Church, I hear that all the time, that you should not offer ayahuasca to everyone, but you should not reject it. So in the same sense, I guess, that science have to find a balance and understand that, it's not everyone that likes roller coaster. So yeah, whenever, someone wants to step in the roller coaster, then you'd be open to open the door, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.